All right. Hello, everybody. This is perhaps a randos record, I think. I don't think there have been 5 people on a randos conversation before. We are going to be doing a commentary on the Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Pageau video that dropped yesterday. I think obviously this conversation's right in the sweet spot of what this community likes to talk about and think about. And I thought that the conversation didn't disappoint at all. So I'd be curious in your guys' first impressions.
Yeah, well, my first impression is finally, right? It's like Peterson, this is the first conversation where I feel like he was being real, because and it's interesting. It's like, he's noted for how much he for how much he values honesty, but it's pretty clear that there was a level of deception in some of those earlier conversations that he had, where he was portraying himself as being more okay than he actually is. And so in the conversation with Pageau, he became genuinely vulnerable, which allowed him to go, to go beyond this sort of surface level conversations we've been having up to this point. So that was my number one takeaway, is just this is real. This is him being authentic.
I agree with that. I love Peterson so much, and not that you don't. I just want to push back that I would think in his earlier conversations, I think part of what's going on is, I think of it as, Pageau talks about this too, even in a house, there are inner and outer rooms, and to varying degrees based on temperament, people share different things with different people. And it's not about dishonesty. It's about communion and trust and relationality. And there's just certain things that that my bedroom isn't meant for everyone. My kitchen isn't meant for everyone. The foyer is maybe meant for some people if I don't really know you. And there's just certain things I'm not going to share with you because I don't trust you. And I think Jordan Peterson was right to not trust a lot of those people, because he's dealing with ideologues and assholes, anyhow, just a little defense. I agree with you, but I want to.
Right. Well, I'm not saying it's not that I'm saying he was consciously lying, but he was there was a little bit of effort to put on a brave face. Yeah. He definitely was. There was some level of deception in the earlier conversation about what his personal level of function actually is.
True. Yeah.
I believe at one point he actually said he thought he was about 80%, and then he's talking to Pageau, he says 5%. So that's a direct contradiction. One statement was false or the other. I believe the 5% was probably closer to true. So that's all I'm saying. Which is it's totally
hyperbolically, Nate. If you're gonna fact check me, it would be terrible.
Yeah. Oh, I wouldn't want anyone to fact check me either. Don't get me wrong. And I'm not. It's not no judgment. I'm just glad to see Jordan get to a place where he can have an authentic conversation and be open about where he really is.
My first takeaway was that we should all be praying for him, especially anybody that's been blessed by his work.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I want to commend Pageau for basically the way he handled everything was really good, because there's not that Pageau would, but he even says that I don't feel like I can moralize with you about this at this time. In the face of suffering like that, the best thing you can do is sometimes be silent. And then, since we have to talk about it with Pageau showed a lot of restraint and grace and concern, that, I don't know, I appreciated.
It's he's familiar with Job, even though he didn't bring it up explicitly. He knows.
Yeah, I wish he brought up Job.
Yeah. Well, he just modeled the appropriate and opposite behavior of what you see in Job.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting. I think Jordan Peterson was more honestly curious to hear what Pageau would say, and he wasn't just asking questions to sort of keep the conversation going, kind of in an interview where you kind of half predict the answer. Yep. He was asking questions where he's please help me, Jonathan.
Yeah.
Like, what are you going to say?
Yeah, like Sam, at the point where he says, like, when he talks about him, because he's like, you weren't born Orthodox. Tell me how you did it.
Yeah.
The way he said that, it's like, that was like he really meant that question from the depth of his being. Like, show me how it's done. I don't understand how you did it. I want whatever it is you have, but I can't see a way to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a point I hope we really touch on, because his aversion to so-called Christianity and Christian practice and church, and even because that was a little joke in there, like, you're one of the few people who've actually seen me in church, and how did that go? So like, he has, and he said before, like, he doesn't want, he feels like his skin is like crawling in church almost. And it's not, and what's crazy is it's not, in my opinion, I think the reason he feels that way, a lot of it is whether or not his attention to it and his focus on it is misaligned in the value hierarchy, his own personal value hierarchy. That's something, it just is what it is. And I don't think that his reaction to that is necessarily off, I mean, his qualms with Christian practice in the church, I think, are legit, but like, I don't know. I hope we just get into part of that too. But.
All right. Well, it would need to be the right church too, right? I mean, I don't know what church he was in before, so
yeah, either Orthodox or like a crazy charismatic church where he doesn't need to sit still. Just Jordan Peterson running up and down the aisles waving banners. I think that maybe could work.
Yeah.
Well, actually, that's actually like, okay, maybe this is just because I am Catholic, but since his wife is Catholic, that's actually one of the areas where I think like Pageau kind of overstated the case for orthodoxy a few times, I think. And it's like particularly as it comes to theosis, because like there definitely is within the Western Catholic tradition an understanding of theosis, maybe not as clearly in some of the later theologians, but certainly it's there in Aquinas for sure. And, I wouldn't like, especially since his wife is Catholic, that's not a tradition you'd want to steer him away from.
Yeah. All right. I've got our first clip lined up. Let's see if I can pull this off, and hopefully the audio's on the recording when this happens too. All right. This is about 5-6 minutes long. Okay. Can you see the screen, everybody? Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Here we go. I'm going to do this on normal speed, just in case anyone watches us on 2x. I don't want to watch this on 2x and then all of a sudden Jordan Peterson's on 4x. I think that would be a little bit crazy. So might feel like he's crawling through molasses, but that's what I'll do.
I think while I have been dealing with these, borderline religious issues, certainly not just borderline, there's lots of religious people who seem to think that I'm dealing with religious issues. And that's really what I wanted to talk to you about tonight. So this book I mentioned earlier talked about disagreements with my conceptualization of Christ, let's say, and I'm not sure what that conceptualization is, by the way, exactly. It's a mystery to me. But I can say some concrete things about it. I mean, I understand and appreciate the symbolic significance of the ideal human being. And that finds its embodiment. And I took these ideas in large part from Jung and Erich Neumann, that Christ is at least a representation of the ideal man, whatever that is. And we all, interestingly enough, we all seem to have an ideal. And that ideal has us.
Hey.
So this is where, okay, I just want to jump in a little bit, because Peterson is anytime you're somebody who's so precise in their language and is being very intentional and has thought about things a lot, you have to really listen to what they're saying. And Peterson makes explicit, I'm careful in my speech. And so, like, I don't know, it'd be interesting to see what that book has to say about how they disagree with his conceptualizations of Christ, because even there he said, I'm not even sure what that is. So what you think you're disagreeing with, I'm not even that solid on it. But also he's really careful, because he's trying to talk about things within his area of expertise. So he talks about it within psychological terms, but he always, like, he he said it's at least this. He's not denying things there. He's leaving space. But I think when people who either temperamentally or culturally lean a little bit dogmatic and fundamentalist in their Christian traditions, they hear that and they're like, well, he's denying the incarnation. But like, listen to what he's saying. He's saying, like, I believe that Christ, and he's meaning Jesus, is the ideal manifestation of these archetypes. That's not a denial of things that you want him to affirm. You're just not listening well enough.
Yeah. Yeah. And this book that he's mentioning, that these Catholic writers associated with Bishop Barron, I think like that book is like looming over this conversation. It seems like you'd read it that morning or something like that. And so anyway, I'm curious to hear that book, but I think that that's a large part of what's going on in this conversation. All right, I'll go back.
Right. And that's where it's very interesting to consider the role of conscience, because your conscience will call you out on your behavior. And so it seems to function as something that's somewhat independent, or at least as something that you can't fully voluntarily control. Because if you could voluntarily control it, then you just tell the pesky little bastard to go away, or to pat you on the back continually, because there must be few things in life more pleasurable than being a fully committed narcissist, to really believe that everything that you do is right and that you're a good person. And I suppose if you could wave a magic wand and rearrange your mind so that it was constantly telling you that, you'd do it. But you don't seem to be able to do that in relationship to your conscience. It trips you up. And so it tells you when you're not living up to your own ideal. And that means that you have an ideal and you don't even know what the hell it is, but you certainly know when you transgress against it. And I know that there's a strong line of Christian thinking that's identified the conscience with divinity, sometimes with Christ inside, sometimes with the Holy Spirit. And those are very interesting conceptualizations, but you can think of them psychologically, and you can even think about them biologically, you know, to some degree, because we're so social. If we don't manifest an appropriate moral reciprocity, we're going to become alienated from our fellows, and we won't survive, and we'll suffer and die, and we certainly won't find a partner and have children successfully. And so to some degree, the conscience can be viewed as the voice of reciprocal society within, and that's a perfectly reasonable biological explanation. But the thing is the deeper you go into biology, the more it shades into something that appears to be religious, because you start analyzing the fundamental structure of the psyche itself, and it becomes something. Well, it becomes something with a power that transcends your ability to resist it. So you can think about Christ from a psychological perspective, and my critic, this particular critic that I've been reading, said, well, that doesn't differentiate Christ much from a whole sequence of dying and resurrecting mythological gods. And of course, people have made that claim in comparative religion. Joseph Campbell did that, and Jung to a lesser degree, I would say, but Campbell did that. But the difference, and C.S. Lewis pointed this out as well, the difference between those mythological gods and Christ was that there's a representation of, there's a historical representation of his existence as well. Now, you can debate whether or not that's genuine. You can debate about whether or not he actually lived and whether there's credible objective evidence for that, but it doesn't matter in some sense, because it does, but there's a sense in which it doesn't matter because there's still a historical story. And so what you have in the figure of Christ is an actual person who actually lived, plus a myth. And in some sense, Christ is the union of those two things. The problem is I probably believe that, but I don't know. I'm amazed at my own belief, and I don't understand it. Because I've seen sometimes the objective world and the narrative world touch. You know, that's Jungian synchronicity. Yeah. And I've seen that many times in my own life. And so in some sense, I believe it's undeniable. You know, we have a narrative sense of the world. For me, that's been the world of morality. That's the world that tells us how to act. It's real. Like, we treat it like it's real. It's not the objective world. But the narrative and the objective world touch. And the ultimate example of that, in principle, is supposed to be Christ. But I don't know what to... that seems to me oddly plausible.
Yeah.
But I still don't know what to make of it. It's too... partly because it's too terrifying a reality to fully believe. I don't even know what would happen to you if you fully believed it.
All right. I'll stop before Pageau answers. Man, like, watching that again, that's like my third or fourth time watching that now. It's so raw. Like, I almost don't even know how to react to that.
Yeah, it definitely is raw. Yeah.
It's hard for me because it's like, you can't, the thing that I get frustrated about with Peterson critics is, I don't know, what do you want from the guy? Like, what more than that could you possibly want from him? Like, he's clearly he's struggling with these ideas and wrestling with them in a way that is genuine. I mean, you're not faking that emotion. And it's, he is, I mean, there's so much in like a technical way. You could wonder about the language that he's using and what exactly he means by it. And even being terrified by his own belief and that he thinks he believes it. I honestly think the difficulty with a lot of Peterson critics is that they can't understand what he's going through because he takes it more seriously than they do. And so I don't think they really understand his struggle because I don't think they've ever really wrestled with it to the degree that he's wrestling with it.
Well, that's part of their irritation, I think, too, is because he's drawing attention to something and saying that we at least need to deal with it and pay attention to it, whereas his opponents are like, no, this is a thing we already discarded long ago that we don't even need. Why are you even bringing this up? Yeah. Like, this is just something from our past that you're trying to, that we've evolved beyond, and you're trying to drag this thing back. Like, why are you doing that? So actually, I think it's part of why they mistrust him, because it's like, that's exactly what they're afraid of. I really want to know because I do care about, I really want to know what he means when he says the objective and the narrative, though.
Yeah.
Like, what is his
using narrative?
What are those in his conception? I wish Jonathan would have asked him to clarify what he meant there.
It's clear. It's from his maps of meaning, right? It's the world of action versus the world of things.
Gotcha.
Right. So it's like the narrative is, you know, what should you do? What is of value? And then the other one is just what is, you know, and what can be described objectively through this scientific method.
I was wondering when he talked about them touching, though, to me he's really getting close to participation there when he talks about those things touching, because that, to me, when he says touching, that means interpenetration, right? So that means that the objective world is no longer purely objective.
So just wait, I need greater clarity too, because even what you just said, Michael, I don't understand. And that seems to be confused with stuff I've heard Peterson say all the time. Because what's interesting is, like, although Peterson is a scientist, I think one of my favorite things that he's ever said and that he talks about, and they talk about in this video, actually, when they talk about chairness and what makes things real and what makes you see something as a unity versus a thing full of its parts? Like, why do you see a chair? Why do you see a beanbag? And that's fundamentally, and the best illustration that I like is when Peterson talks about wholes, and it's almost that reality, objective reality, is more about attention than it is about facts and objects. But like, that seems different than what he's saying there. So it's almost like Peterson is going back and forth between two things. Because I would say Peterson talked about like wholes, and he says even biologically, and I think this works philosophically too, we don't see facts and objects. Like, those things don't exist. You don't see objects, you see potentials. You don't see a whole, you see a falling off potential. But you map that abstraction, that idea, a whole, onto the thing so quickly, so instantly. To bring in Barfield, you map that alpha thinking so fast in your brain. And Rupert Sheldrake actually talks about this in his book, The Science Delusion, is that your thinking and your thought and your idea about a thing, your body actually reacts to stuff before your brain even conceptualize it. So your body is doing things, the action is happening before you even think. But we think the thinking happens first, because the way that the biological mechanisms work is that there's like this, like, I don't even know what it is, microsecond gap that happens, and like there's a little pause, and so you think the thinking comes first, but it doesn't. So you're and so Peterson, I don't know, because I would say objective reality to him is more almost about attention. See, there's all this there's modern smuggling that comes in, because I think people, when they talk about objective reality, mean, well, just, like in my neighborhood, science is real. What do you mean by real? Like, I don't.
Peterson's definitely a modernist, and I think that's where his great struggle is. In terms of why this is ripping him apart, he is trying to keep, as Pageau was saying, he's trying to keep his foot in that world while also straddling this other world, and it's literally ripping him apart to some extent. And I find it odd that he find, well, those worlds are touching all the time.
Yes.
It's only that they're only distinguished in our mental concepts.
Yes.
And so I think that's kind of what he's realizing in those moments, that not only do they touch, but that they're actually one and the same, really, that there is this great overlay. And I think I think he experiences that as a sort of falling into something that he doesn't want to do. He wants to keep his feet firmly on the ground of something he can control. And he's scared. He's scared of what happens if he trusts. And I'm glad that Pageau led him down that, like, belief isn't about propositions. It's about trusting the author. It's suspension of disbelief in saying, okay, the author isn't going to waste my time. He's going to tell me a good story.
Well, that's the basis of reality. I mean, this is stuff that we talk about in the Voxer thread all the time. Is reality, being, ontology, is rooted in communion. And it's rooted in being a person. I tried to bring this up in my book club last night, and I feel like everybody just got mad at me and stared at me blankly. But like, the center of reality is personal. And that's why this is where I've used the terms Eucharistic knowing and mammonistic knowing. Like, you either know things communally through faith, which is fundamentally non-manipulative, non-coercive by its nature, or you know things in a way, you think you know things in a way where you can manipulate and control the world to your personal telos.
But to step into communal knowing means you cannot step into communal knowing without relinquishing that sense of control over reality, which I think is like, it's interesting. Peterson Right. Peterson talks about psychedelics a lot, but I don't know if he's ever personally used them or not. And if he did, I'm sure he would have terrible trips, because as long as you're trying to hold on to that point of view of control, and you're resisting the experience, which is definitely trying to kick you into another way of experiencing reality altogether, where that is just not on the table, then it's bound to be an unpleasant experience. And I'm like that, which is why I've had a lot of unpleasant experiences. But but I know that that's why. So
when
anyway.
you see, if you saw, because like that's what he's saying, he sees these touch points, which he sees most clearly in Christ, where the narrative, I think the story narrative thing is a helpful distinction, because I think of the story as what is. Like story to me is almost like fundamental reality, whereas narrative is like your ideas about the story, which is necessarily a layer of abstracting from the reality. But like when he sees those two things meet in Christ, so I agree. Like Michael was saying this earlier, and Nate, you were saying this, is everything is like that. That's what I call iconic vision. When you see everything is iconic, simultaneously transcendent and immanent, at the same time it's sacramental. Well, everything is like that. But like that is, I think if you try to, if you come into the world with like a modernist frame where those things are necessarily divided, and then you start seeing those things all over, I think it's going to be like what you said with psychedelics. It will be incredibly disconcerting and feel overwhelming, and you'll start to feel crazy, but it's not, but it's because you're tapping into what's really there, and it's not even,
and it's literally blowing you apart.
Yes.
It is literally blowing you apart. But the thing is that you need to be blown apart.
Yes.
So, yeah.
The strange thing is that, I mean, he's articulated that these things are connected before. And so it's weird. He's kind of, and this is the modernist frame, that you can know thing in box X and not have it connected over here in the other parts of your knowledge. And yep. So I feel like he's done all the hard work of a conversion, but he knows it more in his body probably than anything else. I think when he's moved to tears, he's experiencing another reality. But he doesn't want to completely give into it, because he doesn't trust it. If it's certainly a losing of control that he doesn't want to embrace at this moment, or he's worried it's going to crush him or pull him apart. I found it interesting. Pageau at one point talks about in the Orthodox tradition that the gift of tears, and I don't know if anybody else has had experiences of this, but like, there is a feeling in that where there is a sadness and joy commingled, and it can feel like it can feel like if you were to embrace it fully, it would crush you. But I think that's what he's kind of standing at the doorway of. If I walk into this reality, I've so imbibed these truths in other ways, and to think that they're actually real, like the weight of that, I feel like he thinks is going to crush him. He's afraid of it. Also, he does seem to think that there is real value in him standing outside. Well, that standing where he's standing and calling others in is more useful to some larger purpose than him being inside.
Here's where that figure of Beatrice sort of like, deep romantic attachment can kind of be a really good way of understanding this, because there is simultaneously this overwhelming longing, but there's also a fear of rejection. And it is the fear of rejection that is Peterson's block, in my opinion. That's how I read it.
That's interesting. Okay, I think I'll go into our next clip, which I think deals even more with some of the stuff that we were just talking about. All right.
That's right. Yeah, it necessarily. And so
God, I saw that in pro wrestling. There's a great documentary, Bret Hart, called Hitman Hart. It's one of the best documentaries I've ever seen. And it portrays pro wrestling as a stark religious battle between the forces of good and evil. And Bret Hart, who at one point was the most famous Canadian in the world, was overwhelmed by the archetypal force of his representation as the good guy. It's a great documentary, Hitman Hart. And it shows you how pro wrestling is it's not the world's most intellectual activity, to say the least, and people can easily be dismissive of it. But one of the things I loved about the documentary was that it attempted to understand from within what was compelling about what was being portrayed. And it was a religious drama. It just was shocking and brilliant.
And so that is actually, there's an objective part of that there's an objective way in which these patterns kind of come together and manifest, let's say, higher and higher versions of this drama. And so the sports drama has a certain level, but it's limited to a certain extent because it still happens as a confrontation, let's say, between two irreducible sides. And so what happens in something like the story of Christ is that gets taken into one person. And so all the opposites become the king and the criminal, the highest. Even in the image of the cross, you have this image. And as Christ is being crucified, they're putting a sign above his head saying that he's the king. As Christ is being beaten, they're giving to him a crown. And so Christ joins together all the opposites. And so in his story, you see, if you're attentive to these patterns, you see the highest form of this pattern being played out. And one of the aspects that has to be there for it to be the most revealed or highest form is that it also has to include the world of manifestation. I mean, it can't just be a story. It has to be connected to the world. So that's why Christians insist on the fact that Jesus is not just a story, that he's an incarnated man, that he was incarnated.
But I don't believe their insistence. I don't believe, well, this is because it isn't obvious to me. And I think maybe I derived this criticism from Nietzsche, but people have asked me whether or not I believe in God, and I've answered in various ways. No, but I'm afraid he probably exists. That's one answer. Yeah, no, but I'm terrified he might exist. That would be a truthful answer to some degree, or that I act as if God exists, which I think is, I do my best to do that. But then there's a real stumbling block there because there's no limit to what would happen if you acted like God existed.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because I believe that acting that out fully, I mean, maybe it's not reasonable to say to believers, you aren't sufficiently transformed for me to believe that you believe in God, or that you believe the story that you're telling me. You're not a sufficient. The way you live isn't sufficient testament to the truth. And that's people would certainly say that, let's say, about the Catholic Church, or at least the way that it's been portrayed, is that with all the sexual corruption, for example, it's like, really, you believe that the Son of God, that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, and yet you act that way, and I'm supposed to buy your belief. And it seems to me that the Church is actually quite guilty on that account, because the attempts to clean up the mess have been rather half-hearted in my estimation. Yeah. And so I don't think Christians don't manifest this, and I'm including myself, I suppose, in that description, perhaps, don't manifest the transformation of attitude that would enables the outside observer to easily conclude that they believe.
Yeah.
That section kind of reminds me of like the ontological argument, right? Which is like one of the most kind of controversial but interesting proofs for God. Like, imagine a being greater than that being. Okay, keep doing that until you're imagining the greatest possible being. And we all know that it's greater to exist than to not exist. So therefore, the greatest possible being exists, and that's God, right? It's so, and some people are like, wait a minute, you pulled a fast one on me. And some people are like, well, yeah, that makes intuitive sense. And, I think Anselm was sort of the originator of that argument, and people have argued about it back and forth for a long time. I think Descartes liked it, but other people don't. It's sort of like, all right, imagine a story. Okay, make the story a little bit better. Okay, you've gotten to the point where it's the greatest possible story that can be told. Okay, and we all know that stories are better if they're real than if they're not real. What exactly that means is hard to say. So therefore, the greatest story ever told has to happen, right? And then it's like, well, wait a minute. I'm not sure. Some people would be like, yes. And some people are like, no, I can't follow you that far. And I feel like that's exactly what Peterson is doing. It's like, well, yes, I have to admit that Jesus is the greatest possible story ever told. He seems to seep into everything. It's like he goes down the furthest, he goes up the highest, right? Yada, yada, yada. But is this just a really good Harry Potter novel? Or is this something that you can base your life on? I feel like that's where he's at.
But don't you think that's what he's kind of saying is, I do believe that, like, it makes sense to me, whether it's psychologically, whether it's archetypally, whether it's like when Pageau was talking about, it's the union of all these things. He's nodding in agreement. He's being crucified and crowned. Peterson acknowledges all of that stuff. But then where does he go? The problem he has with that is that all of the church and the professing Christians, he's like, I don't think you really, what it would mean for me to believe that terrifies me. And the incarnation of all the believers in that profession, he's like, you don't act like you believe it. So to me, it's really coming down to not an ontological argument and an abstraction of like, this makes sense in like, this is rationally cohering and making sense. It's a James thing. Like, even the demons believe and shudder. The demons believe in God. But Peterson is saying, you're not acting like saints. You're acting like pedophiles. So like that's a struggle, I think, it's the, like the Buddha quote people love to bring up. Like, I love your Christ, but I don't believe these Christians. And I think that's a struggle that people really have, which probably.
Well, the record showed that was a Gandhi quote,
or Gandhi. Yeah. Again, fact check me. See, I don't, my facts aren't good, but then that comes into, that's why he writhes in church.
So here's the thing. I'm glad Sam, I'm glad you pointed that was Gandhi, because I think like here my Christian anarchism is going to come into the conversation, because I think that the problem and the reason that Peterson's not able to see that is that in the process of being focused on preaching the gospel about Jesus, the church lost the gospel of Jesus. Like, where are the genuine kingdom building efforts in the church today? Like, especially in the modern age, where we have allowed the secular market state to like take over every single aspect of life that the church used to have a role in. Like, where is that? And I think that it might be easier for people like Peterson to see that if we took the gospel of Jesus as seriously as we took the gospel about Jesus. And I bring that up because of Tolstoy and the connection to Gandhi, because Gandhi was heavily influenced by the kingdom of God is within you in establishing his nonviolent movement. So I think that like we can't, Christians need to like seriously take nonviolence seriously, or it's going to perpetually be difficult for people to take what we say about Jesus seriously. If we were living in a way that was in accordance with the gospel of Jesus, it would be easier for people to believe the gospel about Jesus.
Well, right, Nate, and that's a lot of it. Is, I mean, we've especially in America, I mean, Christianity has been conflated with, I mean, I'm on board with you with statism and nation building. And that's how a lot of people, I mean, truly, it seems like a joke, but that's how a lot of people think of like one of the primary ways that they are building the kingdom is like they're donating to a political party to get a president elected,
Well, let me poke Eastern Orthodoxy a little bit. I think that that part of it was, so back in the days when there was no separation between church and state, like the Byzantine Empire was a church, a theocracy, a theocratic monarchy, right, for like 1,000 years. And so when the state, extends some poverty program, say, imagine, the the welfare reforms of 800 AD in Constantinople, right? They are viewing themselves as kingdom building when they do that. When they conquer some lands from the Muslims, sorry about that's a violent example, but they are kingdom building, kingdom expanding, etc. Right? They can tie those things together, right? When the state does something that is Christ-like, it is the kingdom of God because we have, the patriarch and the emperor, etc. And that literally, in some sense, was Christendom, the same way that the church is the one true church, the empire was the one true Christendom. And, that kind of has fallen apart. It fell apart in the East, it fell apart in the West, and who knows if those two things could or even should ever be tied back together. But we kind of have this weird way where in our America being kind of a Christian country, kind of not a Christian country, at least certainly a Christian in a very different sense than the Byzantine Empire was, is it Christian to vote for a new poverty program that we think is, doing the work of Christ, but it's paid for by taxes and distributed by the state, and the state is officially secular? And so I think that's part of, and that's related to what Peterson is saying, right? Like where is this kingdom? Where are these Christians? Where are these alleged saints that are supposedly believing that the story became real? Because all I see are pedophiles and creationists.
Which is the very legitimate question that Jacob keeps asking too, right? It's like, if we want Jews to take the Christian claims seriously, then we need to take the kingdom seriously.
Yeah.
But this is where it's too, I don't know, I agree with you. I mean, with those critiques of orthodoxy, but and I haven't read The Kingdom of God is Within You, but I'm very much with Nate, with Christian anarchism and also Christian personalism, and why, again, back to the whole, like, two different ways of knowing, whether it's communal, Eucharistic, or mammonistic, which is about coercion and control, where you're trying to fix the world through systems and external things. But Christianity is fundamental, like, how do you change the world? You die. Chesterton, what's wrong with the world? I am. Like, it's very, the violence is always imposed on the self, whereas the state cannot function that way. Like, the state is of a completely different nature. And I think that's the struggle. I think that's the struggle with a lot of Peterson, is he sees all this institution and structure and churching stuff as a lot of mammonistic knowing, as a lot of control and manipulation. And he is, I think, rightly repulsed by that. And so I think he has this internal dilemma and conflict of, like, I'm very compelled by this vision of Jesus and Christ, and that all makes sense to me. But then this thing, which is the purported his body and his instantiation, seems to be in contradiction to that. And so he's just like, I don't know what to do with that.
I think a lot of it has to do with, like, a misunderstanding of power. I think if you ask the overwhelming majority of Christians what they think God's power is, like, what is the nature of God's power, they will give you something that just resembles human power, only bigger. No. God's power is nothing like our power at all. God's power is his pure energy, which is related to his fundamental nature, which is love, which is the driving force behind creation.
What's that verse? God's power is made perfect in weakness, I think.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yes. But somehow, we somehow lose sight of this all the time. It's like, I don't know very many Christians who, like, when they think about God's power, it's like they are thinking in terms of human power, only bigger. It's just like a really powerful superhuman.
And that's Peterson's critique, and to point the finger at myself too. Like, I'm not very good at where I am most real, which is in my community and my family. I don't often, with my kids, where I could most model Christ, or with my wife, I'm not modeling that kind of power with them either very often. So I mean, I get it. Like it's a universal.
It's hard.
problem. Yes.
Yes, it's hard. And it's not, and that's the thing about Christian anarchism too, is like it's Christian anarchism's goal is not to like, it's not the goal of Christian anarchism isn't to like change the state. It recognizes what the fundamental nature of the state is. The goal of Christian anarchism is to go about for the church to go about its business as if the state weren't there. We should just have no concern about how the state conducts itself, because its structures are inherently like about power and domination and hierarchies of power and domination. It's irredeemable by its nature. It will always tend toward the totalitarian. Now, the current direction of its totalitarian impulses is through enslavement through absolute freedom, which actually ends up breaking down into ultimately a narrative about power, because it's using it to control people.
Since we're talking about politics and power, did anybody else find it interesting that, I don't know, Pageau makes the link between Peterson and Cyrus? And then I don't know, anybody who's followed the whole Trump phenomenon knows that within the evangelical sectors, that same kind of like all the prophetic people are going, oh, Trump is Cyrus, you know, because that label fits because, right, you're necessarily outside of the Christian order. You're almost explicitly not Christian, and yet you're fulfilling some sort of God ordained role. I don't know. There's something really interesting there, and they both came to the forefront right around the same time in 2016. So I just found that very interesting. Just, I don't know. There's, I don't know. Like, I think, you know, when I think about, you know, the prophets and whatever, how God speaks to people, like you can get it right and get it wrong at the same time. And I don't know, maybe there is some movement going on, but we're just fundamentally misunderstanding it. I don't know. In the way the evangelical church is structured, but, you know, it was amazing to see how, you know, Trump got kind of voted up the ladder with this sort of this crown of God's approval, in spite of his character, and Peterson's almost the exact opposite. You know, he's somebody who you know, the reason he squirms in church is first of all he's judging the church itself, but also I think he's judging himself as well. Like that, what you were saying earlier about Nate, about that sense of rejection. He's imagining this perfect God and what that perfect God would say about his life, and knowing that he doesn't measure up, and he takes it all deadly seriously, you know.
He does.
He's going to go up the hill all by himself. He's going to push that rock up the hill, take the cross, and one thing you can't say about him, if you spend any time interacting with him, is he takes character deadly seriously, you know. And I'm sure he's made many, many mistakes, but I don't know. Isn't a person I would trust more to try and tell the truth when everything was on the line. I can't think of somebody that I would trust more.
Oh, he's 100. I would say he's a better man than I am, for sure. You know, it's like, I think it'll be interesting to see if he can ever come to a place of like, of acknowledging like, I will never be good enough. I think that will change kind of a little bit about how he feels about the failings of the church, right? So I just got done critiquing the church quite a bit, but you know, I have to be able to forgive the church, because I'm not doing any better job than what I'm critiquing in the church at large. I'm failing miserably too. The kingdom is a hard thing to live into. It's a hard thing to act out.
Also, Jess hasn't said anything, but I'd like to hear him say something about what he would have hoped Pageau would say to Peterson about Job. And just to set it up, I found it interesting at the end, they start talking about St. Michael. And St. Michael famously is the archangel that in the Bible is always purported to be fighting with Satan directly, right? And Satan plays a really interesting role in that story of Job. And I don't know if anybody remembers this. I'm sure some rando out there can recall chapter and verse, but somewhere Peterson tells a story where he has this dream, and in the dream, he's fighting Satan. And then God at the end tells him, I'm letting you fight Satan because I know you're going to win. Does anybody remember that? I don't know where that came from, but anyway, I feel like that's almost verbatim what the story of Job is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've been, I mean, I kind of don't know where to start. Like, I wish there's something between the suffering of Job and the renewal and the birth of creation. And then you see this also in the suffering of Christ. And so when, you know, the symbolic way of seeing it is Christ goes to the cross, and then when the soldier stabs him in the side with a spear, out comes a rush of water and blood. Well, that's birthing fluid. Like, okay, so what that's how Adam was taken from this, or Eve was taken from the side of Adam. Adam gave birth to Eve through his side, and Christ gives birth to the church through the suffering of the cross. Now, I bring that up because it's like what Sherry was asking just earlier on Voxer. What's that pattern between why do good people suffer? Well, it's almost like it's almost just a childbirth narrative. You have the woman who carries the child, and then the birthing process is painful. And I wrote down Jonathan Pageau is like a midwife in this video. He's like, like Peterson's just like sweating and like, what's going on? I can't do this. He's like, yes. He's like, well, let's talk about trust. Let's talk about, you know, and he's like just so calm and like just trying to keep, you'd be like,
I'm not going to moralize you right now, honey. Just keep going.
Yeah.
And that's, you don't. So when my wife was, I was a terrible, I was a terrible support person for my wife when she was giving birth to our sons. And it's one of my regrets. But for our youngest son, we had a really good midwife, and she was just like always there. What do you need? And my wife will be like, I need to stand up. All right, stand up. Like, I need to sit down. All right, let's sit down. All right, I need to get in the bath. Let's get in the bath. You know, there was no like, there's no rationality to any of it. There's no, and there's no talking to her. Be like, you don't really need to lay down. You're just giving birth, and you just need to go through this. And like, that was kind of my attitude, and I was such a bonehead. Anyway, but you know, so Sherry asked the question, like, what's this pattern of like this sort of the good person ends up suffering, and why? Well, Job suffered in a way it's too complicated to just get through here, but Christ suffers to give birth to the new creation. He literally starts the new creation through what he does. And so is that what's going on here?
Peterson's definitely given birth to something. I mean, we're having this conversation right now because of him.
Well, and here's the thing though. The child could be stillborn. The mother can die.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So
hence we should all be praying for Jordan.
Yeah, it's not clear what's happening or what will happen. And I'm like getting emotional about this, and it's, you know, part of it's about Peterson, but it's just part of it is, you know, just our culture and our future and stuff like that. And you know, there's no guarantees. And yeah, so I just, you know, I'm really interested to see what happens, because I think Peterson's on the edge of something important. And Jonathan's there too. And yeah, I don't know what's going to happen. Because it's like the world that Job lived in before his trials was not the same world after. Is a whole different world. And part of what Job had to come to was exactly what Pageau was talking about, was trust. Like, he had to trust that this was a good creation and that this was something good. What God's doing is good, despite the way it looks. So yeah,
it's an acceptance, I think, and it's outside of your expectations. One thing that I'd love to bring, two things, is that Pageau has said this before, and I've had this intuition also, that I think we are in the midst of a spiritual reawakening and a religious revival of sorts. And I do believe that I don't know how fast it's going to happen. I would say, anywhere from 0 to 50 years, but I think imminently a return of like mass overt religious conversion, expression, practice is going to happen. And a lot will come with that. Like, that's not something that Nate has said this before, and I agree. And this actually came up in my book club last night. That doesn't mean overt religiosity isn't just, I think at a really superficial level, you go, yay. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be easy and without chaos and difficulty and struggle. It's just everything will be, all the chaos, I think, that was like suppressed and pushed back and in psychologies and medicated through all these other different things is going to be apparent to everyone, I think. And I think Peterson and Pageau are in the middle of doing that, giving birth to that. But I agree, like, you could die in that process. And it's what I see is happening is like the death of, I see the death of identitarianism happening, both inside and outside the church. And I think a lot of that is what Peterson is like, because everybody from every angle wants to use him. The people that don't like his, what they perceive to be his politics don't like him, and they use him and they write hit pieces. Certain people in the church, when he doesn't say the things they want him to say, don't like him, and they want to use him, and they write articles. Everybody is they want Jordan Peterson to be a superficial, I would say idolatrous avatar for their identitarian projects. And he refuses to be it, which is a big part of his suffering, combined with health and personal things and stuff like that. But I don't know. He is a Job figure, and it is a trust figure. And I think personally, that's what's going on with Jordan right now. It reminds me of Paralandra, and I bring this up a lot, but it's the Green Lady. And it's one of the most prominent things that stuck out to me is when she's talking to Ransom, when she first sees Ransom and she mistakes him for the king and she's excited to see him. And then he shows up and it's funny because her reaction to that is like, oh, I thought it was the king and it's not. So she doesn't necessarily have disappointment, and that confuses Ransom. As he's just like, how is that not disappointing? Like, how are you not frustrated that you expected the king, and how are you not let down? And that is like a revelation to her, because she's like, oh, in your world, it's possible to have an expectation. And then when your expectation isn't met, when God brings you something other than what you expected, you are the kind of people that could hold your desire onto the expected good rather than the good that was truly brought to you. And so I bring all that up because I see a lot of what Christianity is and what theosis is, in my opinion, is, and this is connected to Job, is a leaning not on your own understanding and an acquiescence to letting God be God, and a submission and obedience to him is like, whatever you bring me, I will accept it. It's an acceptance of letting God be God, And I think identitarianism is the opposite of that, where it's not, you could use all this language about God, but you're not allowing God to be God. You're using all that to manipulate and control your world. And I think Peterson is like the incarnation of someone on a rock. He's a rock on which many people will be broken, because he's not going to do that for any party. And I think it frustrates. But in doing that, he's going to bring to light that, like, these Christians, these social justice warriors, all these different people that are in all these different identitarian camps, that's not the true difference. The true difference is those who use truth to manipulate, and those that non-coercively, non-violently, non-manipulatively let God be God, in lieu of Job, you know, because that was the thing. That's the whole thing of Job. Everybody's trying to understand, like, we need to figure this out.
Well, the other thing is Job has such a key role in that book, because the whole, like, the twist in the book of Job is it's not just let God be God. God needs Job and trusts Job also, because if Job cracks and curses him, then the gig is up. God's not really good. He's just powerful. Because that was the bet, because Satan's like, looks at Job, says, Job, of course Job worships you. You protect him. If you take away that protection, he won't. He'll curse you. And so the bet, in, you know, the way I think about it is, God, you're not truly good. You're just powerful and protect things. Like, if you weren't, if you didn't control everything, then it wouldn't be this, it wouldn't be good. And God, you know, in wisdom, you can see just how, what's better, a world where everything is controlled and manipulated like a machine, or a world where things are actually free and cooperate? And the world where everything is actually free and cooperates is a better world, but the protection has to be taken away. It's an awakening, or Job is thrust out into the harsh realities all at once, the harsh realities of every type of human suffering, I would say. So he's like an archetypal sufferer, but God needs him to cooperate despite this. And the miracle of the book of Job is that he says in the end, he's like, yeah, there are things going on that are beyond what I can imagine. And when he says that, he's not saying, he's saying there's goodness happening here that's beyond anything that is happening to me or that I can perceive. And God doesn't hold back. God shows Job everything. But he needs he trusts Job. He's like, the reason why you're chosen is because you were the best man. And so, you know, it's this weird interplay between Job and God, and how that whole story works itself out, because in a way, God gives up control and trusts Job.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing that's interesting is we kind of touched on this, like, people keep trying to turn Peterson into some sort of archetypal figure or another, but neither Pageau nor Peterson seem to know what archetypal figure he's being turned into, right? They're master pattern recognition people. They're master symbologists, or whatever the right word for that is. And neither Peterson nor Pageau has any clue what archetype or pattern or character Peterson is really playing. And there is certainly a lot of Job there, right? And Job is obviously kind of a foretype of Christ in many ways. I'm not saying that Peterson is a foretype of Christ or something like that, but all Christians to some degree or another are a post type, or however what the right word is of that for Christ, if you stick to, the way, I guess.
Following in the pattern, what else is there?
Right. And so you can see a lot of Peterson's actions are very similar to Jesus, where there's just this culture war clash, right? Vanderklay talks about that all the time, that Jesus was like this lightning rod figure in the center of a white hot culture war fight. And no, every side kind of wanted to use him, but no side felt like it could control him. And that's kind of what inevitably leads to his death. And I certainly hope that Peterson doesn't have some sort of tragic mob death in front of him, but there are some ways in which he has been his character has had attempted assassinations on him multiple times, but yet he keeps walking.
Well, maybe, I mean, there's the pattern of Paul. Like Paul doesn't, in the book of Acts, Paul doesn't die at the end of book of Acts. He gets to Rome. Mm-hmm. And he goes to Jerusalem and is maybe possibly going to be killed. And then, he cries out, or, then he's like, no, I'm a Roman citizen. And then all of a sudden the Roman authorities are involved and then like make sure he's protected. And like all this insane stuff happens that doesn't happen in the story of Christ. Like I remember when I was young and I first read through the book of Acts, I was like, oh, Paul's going to die. Cause I didn't know I didn't remember what happened at the end of the book of Acts. I'm like, he's following in the pattern of Christ. He's going to die at the end of the book of Acts. No, the whole point was to get the gospel to the heart of the empire, to Rome. And, so like, we're talking about Job and we're talking about Jesus and we're also talking about Peterson, and we're like, but the way these patterns play out is not a one for one. Mm-hmm. And there's comparisons to make, but we don't know what's going to happen. Because you can imagine, let's say Peterson just cracks and something terrible happens. He dies. He starts rambling and being very resentful and terrible and acting out of the worst side of himself. I don't know. He just becomes incoherent and just sort of, goes into insanity. We can imagine all these different things happening. Like what would be the result of that? Or even he comes to Christ and he regains his self and he becomes strong again. Like any of those scenarios can still play out and we don't know which one. And there's not necessarily because God had plans for Paul, and it wasn't to die in Jerusalem. It was to go to Rome. And so when he's sitting there in the prison, Christ comes to him and says, be of good cheer, just like you preach here, I'm going to take you to Rome. And then then the rest of the book of Acts is just his story of getting transferred from one authority to another, preaching through the Roman Empire on his way to Caesar for his appeal. And just like, so I'm like very interested in Peterson's story. And even though I see like parallels between and Jonathan being a midwife or whatever, like it's weird stuff to say, but like, who knows? Like it's a strange time.
Well, I mean, I guess that's because at the end of the day, a person isn't an archetype, right? I mean,
Right.
which is part of what the Catholic critique in the book that Peterson was talking about. I'm pretty sure that's like, it's like, it would run along. I haven't read it, but I suspect that it's going to be similar to what David Bentley Hart's critique of Peterson is that the archetype of Christ is not Christ. Like you were talking about an actual person can never be reduced to just a mere archetype. So, and may in fact overlap with many archetypes simultaneously because persons are relationally defined, and archetypes are sort of like these sort of general categories, and a single individual person can actually fit into multiple archetypes simultaneously.
All right, I've got one more clip. I'll pull that up.
Which I can't really relate here, that of the necessity for that community is that this, whatever our fundamental moral load is, immense though it is, crushing though it is even, requires the participation of others. So even if you were the perfect you would need other people to be along with you. It's a collective enterprise, even though it's an individualistic, even though it requires the perfection, it requires as much perfection as is possible at the individual level. That's not enough. There has to be that communal element as well. You need help. We all need help to aim as high. The highest aim requires communal endeavor.
Yeah. And it's also because it actually is the way that everything works. You know, it's like the chair aiming to be a chair is a constitutive of parts which are joined together towards a same goal, and therefore hold together as a being and manifest the chairness of the chair. And that's the same with you. You have all these thoughts, right? You have all these feelings, all these contradicting things inside you. And you need, by aiming up towards, you know, I believe that the image of Christ, let's say, by aiming towards the image of Christ, you constitute your being into that being that's able to attend, to sacrifice, to love. And then that scales up with people.
I agree.
People
well,
together.
And I think you are aiming, and this is something else I tried to point out to Sam. You're either aiming at Christ or something lesser.
Yeah.
Or if things get really out of hand, you're aiming at something opposite, and you don't want to be doing that. And this is a matter of definition in some sense. And it's actually not impossible to understand, is that you aim at something better, generally speaking. I mean, maybe you're out to cause pain, but forget about that. You aim at something better. You wouldn't do it unless it was better. In fact, it virtually defines better. Like the whole idea of better is predicated on the idea that there's an aim that's beyond you. And then the highest of those aims is the highest aim is the amalgamation of all higher aims. And that's a perfect mode of being. And that by definition, that's a psychological perspective again. That by definition is Christ. But then there seems to be something too convenient about C.S. Lewis's insistence that also had to manifest itself concretely in reality at one point in history. And I'm not like, I don't understand why I should believe that. And I tend not to believe things without a why. There's always a why. And there's a hurdle there that I waver on constantly, because I already said that when you think these things through, at least my experience has been, if you think them through sufficiently, you end up with the choice between impossible alternatives. And so
but it has to do, one of the ways to see it maybe is it has to do with the recognizing of the goodness of the world, or the goodness of creation, that the world is capable of manifesting these patterns, right? So
I'll stop there.
I think that's his problem right there.
Yeah, right. And he lays it out, right? He's just fully, like, how many people of his, I don't know, fame or popularity will be that existentially vulnerable about their own religious state and doubts and all that stuff is just crazy. And it's he can only be honest, right? That's not something that you can fake. And there's something about that clip that reminds me just a lot about like Kierkegaard. I feel like Kierkegaard is probably the best guy on this particular question of like, what is faith? How do you go from not faith to faith and stuff like that? Because at some reasons like I have a 2.5-year-old daughter, and she's currently in the midst of the why daddy, why this daddy, why that daddy. And sometimes like, no, I just got to the last why, honey. There is no why after that one. That last answer should have satisfied your whys. And Jordan seems kind of like he's there with this whole question of faith. Jordan, there is no more whys past some point. Like Jonathan Pageau starts talking about, recognizing the goodness of being. I think that honestly, I would say, Jonathan, like, the recognizing the goodness of being is actually kind of downstream from the faith thing, right? I don't think you go from the goodness of being to having faith in it. I think it's the having faith that turns you into the sort of person that sees goodness in being. I don't think I think the
goodness. Yeah, the goodness in God, not necessarily being what is being. The goodness in God can maybe help you with faith. But when you were talking, like the why thing, I've realized this a lot. So I have kids. My oldest is 13, and this happens a lot. He's a smart enough kid, and so he is. He's very much debater and an arguer, and something that I've begun to discern in my kid, and I've started just telling him, is because it's interesting because it parallels my own kind of religious and theological journey through kind of more of a abstracted modern rationalist Christianity to where I am now, which is much more communal and knowledge as being and personal. But like with my son, this happens all the time, is like we get into conversations, and very soon I realize where when we're talking about something and there's something, I've come to the realization, I can see the pattern, that's what's happening. And I do the same thing. So it's not just my son, but there's something he wants. There's an outcome that he wants. And so he brings it to me as the authority and the one who's able to give it to him. And we start watching Netflix, something, wanting a treat, whatever it is, wanting to go hang out with a friend. And we start having this conversation. And a lot of that is that what's going on right there in this talking. Theoretically, it's what I call non-talking talking, but we're having this back and forth of we're giving whys. He's arguing his point, saying why he wants what he wants. And I am either just letting him do it, or I'm telling him why we're not going to do that. And there's a lot of times where that conversation, it happens with my daughters too, where that conversation keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. And I realize, this isn't real communication. This is just people leaning on their own understanding, giving the whys and whys and whys and whys and whys. And so I've gotten to the point of what's essentially happening with my son is that he's not believing something if he doesn't. There's a way you can do that honestly, and there's a way that you can do it dishonestly. Like he's maybe just arguing to get his way when he maybe really somewhere subconsciously sees my point. So that's one thing. I don't think Jordan Peterson's doing that, but there's also a way in which you can be like, I'm not going to do what you say, Dad, until I can understand it. Well, then though, what's happened though there is like, you're no longer the relationship. Then your obedience to me it's not to me. It's to your abstracted ideas. It's to your answer to the why. So you're actually submitted to your reason. You're not submitted to me. So that's not faith. That's rationality. That's disembodied, depersonalized rationality. That's not trust in a person. So I've gotten to the point with my son where I'm just like, you're not submitted to, you're not obeying your ability to understand. That's not what you're obeying. You're obeying me. And I'm not going to play the game where I'm explaining it to you and giving you the why. I'm not going to do that anymore. You obey me because I'm your father. End of discussion. And I used to hate that answer. Like, when people
there's a lot there.
Yes, there is.
When people used to say that, like, you do it because I said so. That's actually a theologically beautiful answer. But people hate it.
Yeah.
So, just really quick on the fundamental goodness of being and God. I think you're just positing the same thing. And let me. I'm going to bring Paralandra in for you here, Luke.
Okay.
I think that the image of the fixed land and the floating land is perfect to understand the difference between the mode in which God is, like true being itself, absolute existence. The fixed land represents that, right? Because it's absolutely like solid. It exists in an absolute sense. Whereas the floating land, this is our natural state. This is how, because we're in the land of becoming. We were constantly in a state of change and flux, and we can't. So we have this desire. So we have to give up that desire for certainty. I mean, that's really. I mean, we can't. We can have all we can have are the best reasons we can have in our finite mode. We are never going to be able to have that absolute certainty, which I think is kind of what Peterson is longing for. It's like he wants to know the why of all whys, like the why that cannot be challenged, like this absolute, like fixed ground. But that is not a position open to us in our mode of being.
Yeah.
Which is why we always, and this is true not just about faith in God. This is how we have to operate in the world.
Yep.
If you waited around for absolute assurance of anything, you could not live.
Right.
You could not function in reality. So yeah. Anyway,
that's really good. I've never actually seen that symbolism in Paralandra, because that's the thing, is they're forbidden from the fixed land until their deification.
Right. And I didn't see it until this conversation. I saw it as this conversation was going on, because you had referenced Paralandra earlier, which put it in the back of my mind. And then we started talking about being, and I had mentioned the difference between being and becoming earlier. And I'm like, oh, that's what Lewis is doing.
No, that's good.
That's what that symbolism is.
Yeah, that's really good.
And Jordan has articulated this before. He knows that there's an infinite number of whys. I mean, he's articulated that really well in other places. It's funny, but he still wants, and I'll say this, that descent down the depths of the whys is the U-shaped journey to some extent.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why we have a high status for that, because there is a real suffering for other people that you can take on by going down those paths. Like, in some sense, I know Descartes becomes a villain in a lot of our stories because of like, oh, he created this, separate world. But there was he initiated his own sort of U-shaped journey with this radical doubt. And there was benefits that other people were able to reap from his going down that path. And I think the problem we have today is that most people don't actually go down the radical doubt path. They try and cite other people's works, and it's more of a status game because we have so much status associated with doing that. But I think he's playing that game very honestly. But I think he could, you mentioned Kierkegaard. I think of that story of, the king and the milkmaid. And that's really what he needs to see things as he's like, well, if God's real, why, and I've been in this place, why doesn't he just write it in the sky? Why doesn't he leave this? Like, I follow this, this detective novel to the end, and I find the key, that fits the lock, and I'm there. Now I'm a Christian. And
and in the laws of mathematics somewhere, it's like, I am God, I exist, here I am. Yeah.
But that's not how a love story works. It's a love story.
God is a lover who wants to be pursued. That's exactly it.
And he could come that way. He could come like the king, with his banners and overwhelm the milkmaid and be like, I'm the king. You love me, right? You want to be rich and successful and powerful and all these things. Come on, love me. And that's not what he wants.
Because it wouldn't be love.
It's not. Yeah. It's actually not what you want. I mean, here's the mercy: is it's also not what anybody else wants. They maybe think they want it. They don't want that.
Yeah. Yeah, he does. No, we don't want that either. If we were going to write our own life story, we wouldn't want that either.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm. It's a deception. All deceptions. All deceptions look real. I mean, Christ, Antichrist. That's it. That's all there is. The real thing and counterfeit. That's it. Everything's like that.
Yeah.
And the end goal is theosis, right? Which is It is a sexual union
Yeah.
between the bride and the bridegroom. And we're kind of in this intervening period before the wedding is consummated. So there's there's a lot of trust that goes into that period.
And if we didn't have that longing for that certainty, we would not be drawn into the process of our own deification to begin with.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's like it's like, so even though we have a tendency to let it to get carried away with it and let us lead us astray, it's also the very thing that will lead us, if we follow it all the way to the bottom and we reach the bottom of the U, that's what will raise us back up too.
Which is where this is, and I'll just say, I say it every time I talk about Jordan Peterson in any conversation. My favorite thing about him is tell the truth or just don't lie. Because if you do, like, I don't even pursuing your certainty, doing an authentic, like true, honest deconstruction, whatever a human being needs to do to be honest. I mean, this maybe touches on the conscience thing. It's never wrong to follow your genuine conscience, ever.
Except that you can trick yourself. Like, I found it interesting earlier when you talked about the whole thing, like, well, we wish we could just trick ourselves into having our conscience tell us that we're good people, but we can't. But I think he forgets his own lessons there, because we can by degrees. We can envelop ourselves in deception over and over and over to the point where, okay, now my conscience tells me I'm a good person when I go, rip off bunches of people because I give some amount of it to charity or something like that. I mean, there's all kind of games we play, and the deceptions get layered upon each other to the point where our conscience can deceive us. I think he's elaborated that very well in his lectures.
He talks about that, because he's like, that's why the Dostoevsky is like, do not lie, especially to yourself. And Peterson, I've heard him riff on that, saying essentially, because then what you do is you contaminate your the organ itself, your organ that is able to see deception, you pollute the very thing. And then it just becomes this, caustic, just like insular closed system that just gets worse and worse and worse. So the worst lie you can say is to yourself.
But at the same time, we can't be so afraid of deception or illusion that we remain paralyzed.
Yeah, or paranoid.
Or paranoid. Yeah, exactly.
Paranoid,
yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Mm-hmm. Well, I got to get running soon. Maybe we should kind of wrap this up. I don't know if anyone has some good final thoughts to get off their chest.
Well, I just wanted to say the three things that Jonathan really emphasized, which I think are just vitally important for today, as well as just myself and personally, especially just trust. So the first one's trust, second one, community, and third one, worship. And all these, like, we as modern Americans or Western folk, we have a lot of problems with these: trusting God, being in true community with each other, and then also worshiping. I know in that last one, like I have, because you want to, like, worship is a letting go, and it's almost a practice of trust and being swallowed up by the thing that's larger than you. And we want to, like, rationalize it. So, like, I'm going to worship because I know that it's the right thing to do, or whatever it is. And so I just really like those three things that Jonathan brought up during the whole talk.
Yeah, worship is, I think, at its core, it's like it's just like it's an acknowledgement of our proper position, right?
Mm-hmm.
So.
Mm-hmm.
So hard, because this is where the deconstruction, is helpful, probably, because, like, even that, people's aversion to it. You can hear Pageau when he kept saying worship. He's like, people aren't going to like it, but that's because they have ideas about it. Like what a lot of people just, like, intuitively, instinctually feel, because I feel that way too. You can have that. When you think worship, you're not thinking like a joyful participation in what you most value, which is inevitable. Like, that's kind of what worship is. They're seeing, like, they're seeing the avatar and like the front of that documentary Jesus Camp. Like that's what they see. You know, they see like a manipulated 10-year-old girl like crying at a charismania camp. You know, that's what they see. And that's, you know, and that's something people have to work through. Like for them to be authentic, for Christians to come in and just be like, if that's the word association they have, and they're just like, and then Christians come in and be like, you got to worship God, and they're seeing this gross thing, like, yeah, it's a lie for them to be like, yay, worship.
It also forces them to bring into question their fundamental assumption, because like the entire project of modernity, for sure, and I think postmodernity in another mode, is assume that the starting point is assume there is no God. Now what can we know? So
it's an theism. Let's tease panentheism. There you go.
So yeah.
All right. With that last note, see panentheism. I think that's a good place to end.